A bully shoved a 74-year-old woman out of her chair at a pancake house in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, right in front of a packed Sunday morning crowd. Not one person stood up. Not one voice was raised. The whole room just sat there, forks frozen, eyes down, pretending they hadn't seen a thing. The bully laughed. He thought he was untouchable in that town. He'd been untouchable for years. But he made one mistake that morning. He had no idea the quiet man walking through the door with the German Shepherd was her son. And he had no idea what that son did for a living. The first Sunday of November in Moose Jaw carries a particular kind of cold. It doesn't announce itself the way a blizzard does. It just settles in, quiet and permanent, like a decision already made. The streets downtown were dusted with the first real snow of the season, thin and dry, skittering across the asphalt in the wind. The grain elevators on the edge of town stood pale against a sky the color of old pewter. It was the kind of morning that made people pull their collars up and walk faster, heads down, grateful for any warmth they could find. Frances Aldridge walked slowly. She always did now. 74 years old, her knees announcing themselves on cold mornings in ways they hadn't bothered to 10 years ago. She wore her burgundy wool coat, the good one she saved, for church and town errands, and her late husband Gerald's scarf wrapped twice around her neck. It still smelled faintly of his aftershave if she pressed her face into it, which she did sometimes, quietly, when no one was watching. She pushed open the glass door of Sunrise Family Pancakes on Main Street. A little bell chimed. Warm air rushed out to meet her, carrying maple syrup and bacon grease and the low murmur of weekend conversation. She'd been coming here every Sunday, for 11 years, the same corner booth by the radiator, the same 2 pancakes with peach compote, the same cup of Earl Grey because she never trusted restaurant coffee. Mel Okafor was behind the counter. 26 years old, sharp as a tack, with close-cropped hair and the kind of composure that comes from working double shifts in a place where everyone knows everyone's business. She spotted Frances and raised a hand in greeting, already reaching for the teapot. Frances settled into her booth, unwound the scarf, folded her coat neatly beside her. Outside the window, a pickup truck idled at the curb, country music bleeding faintly through the glass. She didn't notice the man in the far corner until she heard the voice. It came like a door slamming in a quiet house, big, sudden, designed to be heard. "Well, look who's still taking up space." The voice belonged to Terrance Hodge. He was 51 years old, built like a side of beef, with thick hands and a face that had the permanent flush of a man who drank more than he admitted. He owned Hodge Property Holdings, which was a fancy name for a company that bought up old lots and flipped them with as little investment as possible. He'd been doing it in Moose Jaw for 2 decades. He knew the right people. He had lunch with the right alderman. He called the deputy mayor by his first name. He was sitting with 2 men Frances didn't recognize. Both of them looked at the floor when Terrance spoke, the way people do when they're used to watching someone else be cruel. Frances didn't look up. She picked up the laminated menu she knew by heart and studied it as if it held new information. Terrance pushed back his chair. The legs scraped. It was loud. He wanted it to be loud. He walked over. He was the kind of man who never walked towards someone quietly when he could make an entrance instead. "Your son selling yet?" he said, stopping beside her table. Not sitting. Standing over her, which was the point. Frances looked up at him then. Her eyes were gray-blue and steady. "Good morning, Terrance. It's a simple question. The property isn't for sale." "See, that's funny." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without being asked. "Because everything's for sale. People just need to understand what their options are." Mel had gone very still behind the counter. Her hand was near her apron pocket where she kept her phone. Frances had known this pressure was coming. Her son Nate had bought the old Aldridge lot on the east side of town 2 years ago, the land her late husband's family had farmed for 3 generations before the farmhouse burned, and the fields went fallow. Nate had wanted to rebuild there. A place for her. A place that was still theirs. Terrance Hodge had been trying to acquire that lot for his new development project for 18 months. He'd offered twice through a lawyer. Twice she'd said no. The third approach had been less formal. A flyer slipped through her door with the words "Think" carefully written in pen across the top. "My son's decision is his own," Frances said, "and it's not changing. Your son." Terrance let the words sit there. "Right, the one who's never here, drops in twice a year, pats you on the head and leaves you to handle everything." He leaned forward on his elbows. "Must be lonely. I manage fine. You know what I think?" He lowered his voice, which somehow made it worse. "I think you're a stubborn old woman making decisions about things you don't understand. And I think your son would see sense a lot faster if you weren't in his ear about keeping land that's worth nothing to your family and a lot to this town's future." "I'd like my tea now," Frances said. Directed at Mel. Steady voice. Not a tremor in it. Terrance stood up abruptly. The chair scraped again. He looked down at her the way a man looks at something he's about to step on. "You don't have a lot of runway left, Frances. It might have ended there." He might have walked back to his own table and let it be a bad morning, and nothing more. But Frances said, quietly, without looking at him, "Gerald always said you were the kind of man who mistakes volume for authority." The diner went silent. Every person in the room felt it, the shift in the air, the way Terrance's face changed. Mel's hand went into her apron pocket. Terrance's arm swept the table. Fast, sudden, ugly. Frances's mug, already filled, Mel had moved quickly, flew sideways. Hot tea hit the table edge, the seat, the floor. The ceramic shattered. Frances flinched back and the motion unbalanced her. She went sideways against the window ledge, her elbow striking it hard, and then she slid from the booth seat and landed on the floor. It happened in under 3 seconds. Terrance stood over her, breathing hard, face red, and no one moved. The bell above the door chimed. The man who walked in was in his late 30s. Medium height, lean build, the kind that doesn't look like much until you clock the way he moves. Unhurried. Exact, like every step is placed on purpose. He wore a canvas jacket, dark jeans, work boots, ordinary clothes. Nothing about them could conceal the nature of the man wearing them. Beside him, on a short leather lead, walked a German shepherd, black and tan, deep-chested, with ears that stood straight and eyes that swept the room in one clean arc. The dog's name was Brick. He was 7 years old and had spent 4 of those years in active service. He didn't bark. He didn't lunge. He simply looked at the man standing over the woman on the floor, and he went completely unnervingly still. The man was Nathan Aldridge's son. His name was Cade. No, wait. His name was Reid. Reid Aldridge. 38 years old, Navy SEAL, currently on leave. He had driven 11 hours from CFB Esquimalt to surprise his mother for her birthday, which wasn't until Tuesday, which meant no one had expected him, which meant Terrance. Hodge had no possible way to know what had just walked through that door. Reid took in the scene. His mother on the floor, hot liquid spreading across the linoleum, shattered ceramic. A large, red-faced man standing over her with his chest puffed out. Reid said one word to Brick. Low, flat, barely audible. "Watch." Brick moved, not fast. Controlled. He flowed forward like water, finding a level, and placed himself between Terrance and Frances, close enough that Terrance would have to step over the dog to reach her. He didn't growl. He didn't need to. He sat, and he looked at Terrance with the focused, unblinking attention of an animal that has been trained to make a decision and is waiting only for instruction. Terrance took a step back, one involuntary step. He didn't even realize he'd done it. Reid walked past him. Not around, past, close enough that his shoulder almost grazed Terrance's arm. He crouched beside his mother. His voice was different now, the hard edge gone. Just a man talking to his mother. "Can you get up?" "Oh, I'm fine," Frances said, and then she saw his face and amended it. "My elbow. It's just bruised." He helped her up, careful, easy. He checked the elbow without asking, ran 2 fingers along the bone, and satisfied himself nothing was broken. He looked at the red mark on her forearm where the T had hit. Then he stood up. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't point. He didn't do any of the things a man who wants to seem dangerous does. He just looked at Terrance Hodge and said, very quietly, "You're going to want to stay exactly where you are." Mel had her phone out. she'd been recording since Terrance swept the table. The video was 47 seconds long, and it was already the clearest piece of evidence she'd ever accidentally compiled. She had the presence of mind to text it to her sister before Terrance could think to ask for it. At a window table across the diner, a young man named Patrick, 22, in town for a plumbing apprenticeship from Regina, nobody's idea of a journalist, had his phone up too. He'd started filming when the mug went flying. He had a modest following on social media, mostly hockey clips and campfire cooking. He'd never posted anything that mattered before. He was about to. There was a man in the back corner of the diner who had been watching all of this from behind a newspaper. His name was Dale Pruitt. He was 63 years old, wore his deputy mayor's lanyard even on weekends, and had been enjoying a quiet breakfast before the Hodge situation evolved into something he'd have to manage. He folded his newspaper now and began the slow, deliberate process of getting involved. "All right, let's just bring it down a notch," Dale said, pushing back his chair. Folksy voice, the voice of a man who has diffused small-town complications before. "Reid, good to see you home. Terrance, why don't you head on back to your table? I want a police report filed," Reid said. He hadn't looked at Dale. He was still looking at Terrance. "Now, that seems like a lot of paperwork for. My mother was knocked to the floor. There are witnesses. There is video." Reid turned his head then and looked at Dale. "You're the deputy mayor. Act like it." Dale Pruitt felt something he hadn't felt in a long time in this town, the sensation of being accurately assessed. He saw in Reid's eyes not anger. Anger he could have managed, but clarity, cold, patient, professional clarity. The kind that comes from a man who has spent his career dealing with threats that make Terrance Hodge look like a parking dispute. "I'll make a call," Dale said, and pulled out his own phone, though his expression suggested the call wouldn't go where Reid intended. Reid guided his mother to a clean booth near the front. He sat across from her. Brick settled under the table, chin on his paws, eyes open. Reid pulled out a phone. Not the smartphone he used personally. A second device, matte black, military ruggedized. He scrolled through contacts. He pressed a name. The call was answered in 2 rings. "Wilson." A woman's voice, brisk. "It's Reid Aldridge." He kept his voice low. "I'm in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, on personal leave. I need to flag a situation. My mother, Frances Aldridge, was physically assaulted this morning in a public place. Local enforcement is likely to manage this away. I have civilian video evidence and multiple witnesses. I'm formally flagging a potential compromise of municipal authority and requesting liaison with the RCMP Major Crimes Office in Regina." He listened. "Affirmative. I'll hold position and keep the evidence chain intact." He ended the call. Patrick from Regina was already uploading. He titled his video, "Big Guy Knocks Elderly Woman Off Her Chair at Sunrise Pancakes in Moose Jaw." Her son just walked in the door. He didn't know the son was a Navy SEAL yet. He'd find that out in the comments 2 hours later, when the video had already been shared 30,000 times. By noon it had 150,000 views. By 3 in the afternoon it was on CBC News Online. By 6 it was on the national broadcast. The comments were a river of fury, and somewhere in the middle of them, someone had already tracked down Terrance Hodge's business registration, his 2 sitting alderman connections, and the name Dale Pruitt. In a glass-walled office in a building on Albert Street in Regina, a man named Gordon Slater watched the CBC clip and pressed his knuckles against the edge of his desk. Gordon was 47, developer, investor. The money behind the Moose Jaw Heritage Quarter Revitalization Project, which was a beautiful name for a plan to acquire and demolish a significant portion of the east side and replace it with condominiums priced well beyond what most of Moose Jaw could afford. The Aldridge lot was the keystone parcel. Without it, the project couldn't proceed. He had been paying Terrance Hodge a monthly retainer for 18 months to resolve the Aldridge situation. This was not how he had intended it to be resolved. He picked up his phone and called Terrance. Terrance answered on the 4th ring and sounded like a man who had underestimated a problem. "I told you quiet," Gordon said. His voice was very calm. Calm the way a gas leak is calm before the spark. I told you keep it quiet. And now there's a clip of you knocking over a grandmother on the national news. It was an accident. The man who walked in, her son. My people tell me he's military. Terrance was quiet for a moment. He's just some guy on holiday. Gordon had already had his assistant run the name. Aldridge, Reid. Service records weren't public, but the connections were easy enough to find for someone who knew where to look. Special operations. Decorated. Currently on active duty leave. He's not just some guy on holiday. Gordon said, fix this, tonight, or I will fix it in a way that starts with your name. The call ended. Terrance drove to Dale Pruitt's house at 8 that evening. They sat in Dale's kitchen over rye whiskey and talked through options, discredit the video. Suggest the woman had a balance issue. Apply pressure to Mel at the diner. Her lease on her apartment was through a property management company that had indirect links to one of Gordon's holding entities. Apply pressure to Patrick, a 22-year-old apprentice. Plumber was not beyond the reach of a phone call to his employer. Neither man, in that kitchen, thought to consider what the woman's son was doing while they were planning. Reid had spent the evening quietly. He'd settled his mother into her house, checked the doors and windows, placed 2 small motion sensors at the front and back entries, and set a perimeter alert on his phone. Frances had wanted to feed him dinner and talk about everything but the incident. He'd let her, answering her questions about Esquimalt, about his last deployment, the version he was allowed to tell, and eating 2 servings of the cabbage roll she'd had in the freezer since September. After she went to bed, he sat at the kitchen table with his ruggedized laptop and the names he'd already compiled. Terrance Hodge, Gordon Slate, Dale Pruitt. He built a file. He traced connections. He was methodical. He was patient. He had done this in worse conditions than a Saskatchewan kitchen table. Brick lay across his feet. At 11:15 his phone vibrated. Not his personal phone. The other one, a message from his contact in the RCMP liaison office. Situation elevated. Major crimes are aware. Do not approach municipal authorities. Hold and document. Holding. Evidence preserved. Additional potential leverage identified. Possible property coercion pattern. Multiple households. The response came back in 4 minutes. Keep digging. Gordon Slater had a wife. Her name was Annette, and she was 51 years old, and she had spent 22 years being the quieter half of a loud partnership. She knew about the Moose Jaw project. She knew about the retainer to Terrance Hodge. She had not known until she watched the news that evening with a glass of Pinot Grigio and a growing sensation of nausea that the pressure campaign had extended to shoving elderly women off their chairs in diners. She watched the clip 3 times. The woman on the floor, Frances, was wearing a burgundy wool coat and a scarf that looked handmade. She didn't cry out when she fell. She just lay there for a moment with a kind of stillness that was worse than any sound. Annette set her wineglass down. She had known for some time that the Heritage Quarter project involved more than legitimate land acquisition. She had seen the spreadsheets. She had heard the calls Gordon made late at night when he thought she was asleep. She had made the calculation a dozen times that it was safer and easier to stay quiet. She had made that calculation again this evening, watching the news, and then she picked up her phone. She didn't call a lawyer. She didn't call the police. She called a journalist she had gone to university with 30 years ago, a woman named Carol, who was now a senior investigative editor at the Saskatoon Star-Phoenix. "Carol," Annette said when the call connected. "I have something. I need to know it goes somewhere safe." Carol was quiet for a moment. Then, "How big? Municipal corruption, property coercion, a sitting deputy mayor, and a paper trail going back 4 years. Another silence. "Longer. Where are you right now?" "Gordon's in a call in his office." "I have maybe 20 minutes. "I'm listening." Annette walked to the filing cabinet in the spare room that Gordon thought she never went into. She knew the combination because she had heard him use it so many times it had simply settled into her memory. Inside were the binders, the ones he kept for insurance, signed agreements, payment records, emails printed and dated, a voice memo recorder with 6 recordings, including 2 conversations with Dale Pruitt that were explicit enough to make a lawyer reach for a pen. She photographed every page with her phone. She sent them in a compressed file to Carol's secure email. Then she put everything back exactly as she'd found it. Closed the cabinet, walked back to the living room, picked up her wine. Gordon came out of his office 20 minutes later, looking tight around the eyes but composed. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Fine," Annette said. "I'm just tired." He nodded and went to bed. She sat in the dark living room for a long time after his light went out, her hands in her lap, thinking about a woman in a burgundy wool coat lying on a linoleum floor. Then she thought it was about time. The RCMP arrived in Moose Jaw on a Tuesday morning. 3 vehicles. No sirens. They parked with practiced inconspicuousness outside the municipal building on Fairford Street and walked in with the quiet certainty of people who have done their homework. Their lead investigator was a woman named Chief Inspector Vasquez, 44, with dark hair pulled back tight and a manner that conveyed in under 30 seconds that she had zero interest in small-town politics or the feelings of local officials. She had driven up from Regina with a warrant and 40 pages of documented evidence that the Star Phoenix had passed to her office the night before through proper channels. Reid met her in the parking lot. He handed her a second evidence file, the connections he'd built himself over 4 days, cross-referenced against public property records and business registrations. She looked through it for 3 minutes without speaking. Then she looked at him. "You've done this before," she said. Not a question. "Different context," he said. Brick sat beside his boot and watched the building entrance. Dale Pruitt was in a meeting about a snow removal contract when the RCMP officers walked into the council chamber. He looked up. He saw Chief Inspector Vasquez's face. He looked at the document she set on the table in front of him. He read the first line. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "I'd like to call a lawyer." "That's your right," Vasquez said. "We'll wait." Terrance Hodge was picked up at the Hodge Property Holdings office on River Street at 10:45 in the morning. He came out in handcuffs. His assistant stood in the parking lot with her hand over her mouth. 3 other employees watched from the windows. The arrest was not recorded by any official outlet, but a retired teacher walking her dog filmed 40 seconds of it on her phone and posted it by noon. It had 12,000 shares by supper time. Gordon Slater was not in his Albert Street office when the officers arrived. His assistant said he'd left at 9 for a flight to Vancouver. He had, in fact, boarded the flight. He had, in fact, landed. He had not, in fact, anticipated that the RCMP had coordinated with the CBSA and that there would be 2 officers waiting at the gate with a federal warrant and the precise, unhurried manner of people who had been waiting there comfortably for 40 minutes. He came off the jetway with his carry-on bag and looked at the officers and understood with the flat, airless certainty of a man who has spent 20 years believing himself 3 steps ahead that he was, this time, 3 steps behind. There is a particular silence that settles over a small town after something ugly has been named and removed. Moose Jaw had that silence in the days that followed. People talked about it at Tim Hortons. They talked about it at the curling rink. They talked about it in the parking lot of Extra Foods, engines idling, not quite ready to go home yet. What they were really talking about, under the talking, was the feeling of having watched something wrong happen and having not stopped it. The shame of the still room, the frozen forks. A town council emergency session was called for the Thursday evening. The arena community room was packed. Folding chairs had been brought in from storage and they still ran out. Frances came. She wore the burgundy coat. Reid sat next to her. Brick was under the seat, head on his paws. There were statements from the new interim council chair. There was a formal acknowledgement of the municipal conduct failures. There was a commitment to a third-party audit of all property acquisition agreements involving Hodge Holdings and the Heritage Quarter project. Then Terrance Hodge walked in. He'd been released on conditions pending his hearing. He looked smaller than he had in the diner. He wore a regular jacket and no expression of authority. He walked up the center aisle to the public microphone that had been set up for resident comments, and the room went very quiet. He stood there for a moment. Just stood. "My name is Terrance Hodge," he said. His voice was rough. "And I don't expect anything from you. I'm not here to ask for it." He looked at Frances. "What I did at the diner, there's no way to frame it. I put my hands on an elderly woman in public, and I did it to frighten her. That's the whole story." He cleared his throat. "I've cooperated with the RCMP on everything they've asked. I've provided names and dates and amounts. Whatever they need, I'll take whatever comes from it." He was quiet for a moment. "I've also contacted every family I know of that was pressured through Hodge Holdings over the past 3 years. 11 families. I'm working with a mediator to return the difference between what they were paid and fair market value. It'll take time. Most of what I have. But it's the only thing I can think of that's actually worth doing." The room was still. Reid stood up. Not fast, just stood. "The apology is a beginning," he said. "What you do with the next few years is the proof of it." He glanced at his mother. "My family accepts the offer of restitution. That doesn't mean it's forgiven. It means we're willing to watch." Terrance nodded. He stepped away from the microphone and walked back out the door. Not the way he'd come in. Loud, commanding, filling space, but quietly, shoulders down, the way a man walks when the weight he's carrying is finally the right kind. Mel got the diner manager job. The corporate office flew someone in from Winnipeg to make it official, and the person they sent was brisk and tired from travel, and said almost nothing, except that her approach on the morning of the incident had been exactly right, and that the position was hers if she wanted it. She said yes before he finished the sentence. Patrick from Regina was contacted by 3 different outlets. He turned down 2 and took a meeting with CBC Saskatchewan, which led to a conversation about community journalism, which led to nothing concrete yet, but might lead to something. He went back to his plumbing apprenticeship in the meantime, which he was also good at. Frances went back to her Sunday booth. The new mug was white with no pattern. The tea was Earl Grey. The peach compote ran out 1 week and they'd replaced it with pear, which was not the same, and she said so, and Mel ordered the peach back in. Reid stayed longer than he'd planned. He had a week of leave remaining and he used it. He split wood for the winter. He fixed the gutter on the north side that had been pulling away from the fascia for 2 seasons. He drove with his mother to the Aldridge lot on the east side of town, and they stood there in the thin November snow and looked at the land where her husband's family had farmed for 3 generations and said very little. "You'll really build something here?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "When I'm done." She put her hand through his arm. Brick walked the perimeter of the lot in a slow, calm circle, nose down, ears up, doing what he always did, making sure the ground was solid before anyone else stood on it. Reid looked at the land. The quiet that lay over it, the particular quality of prairie silence, which is not empty, but full of wind and distance and the memory of people who had stood in the same place and decided it was worth staying. He thought about his mother on the floor of the diner, the frozen room, the forks. He thought about the morning she'd called him, 4 years ago, when his father died, and how she'd said, "I'm all right, don't rush," and he'd known from her voice she was not all right and had come anyway. He thought about the USB drive the journalist was building a story around, the 11 families, the spreadsheets, the voice recordings. He thought about Annette, Gordon Slater's wife, whom he'd never met, who had stood in a spare room with her phone, photographing binders, while her husband slept 2 rooms away. He'd heard about it from Vasquez, who'd mentioned it without ornament. The wife came forward. He thought it was one of the bravest things he'd heard of in a year that had contained several brave things. The wind moved across the empty lot. Brick came back and stood beside him. There is a kind of strength that does not look like strength. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't fill a room. It stands in a spare room with a phone and shaking hands. It sits on a floor in a burgundy coat and doesn't make a sound. It walks into a diner with a German shepherd and says 2 words. The narrator has no hometown. But places like this one, Cold, overlooked, full of people who stay, have a particular kind of gravity. They pull things toward rightness, eventually, if enough people refuse to look away. Frances went home. Reid drove her. Brick rode in the back seat with his nose against the window, watching the streets of Moose Jaw go past. The curling rink, the grain elevators, the Tim Hortons on Main. Watching the way a good dog watches a place he's decided to remember. The land on the east side was still there, still waiting. That was enough for now.